Welcome to the final University of Suffolk Social Sciences and Humanities Learning and Teaching webinar of 2022. And what a corker we have for you here today. We are incredibly lucky to hear about some of the creative approaches being used to involve people with lived experience in learning and teaching. So if you ever thought about how you need to go about this in your discipline, or it's something that you're already quite familiar with, but are looking to enhance this, whether you're social work, criminology, history, English, or more, this webinar will give you some ideas to do that, whatever your discipline. This is a slightly unusual webinar in that we're going to hear from different people in different formats, showing you how going the extra mile is certainly worth it. So hold on to your seats. First of all, I'm going to introduce you to the aims of the webinar. So today we're going to encourage you to think about how to involve those with lived experience in your learning and teaching. We're also going to look at some of the benefits of lived experience involvement for the institution and for the individuals themselves. And also, we're going to finish on some of the challenges presented by involving those with lived experience. But this is now for me to hand over to the people that are going to present the webinar to you. So.
Hello everyone, my name is Steve Clark Emerson. I'm a member of what we call Social Work Voices. I've been a member for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years now, and it had different guises at the university before its current one. And our purpose really is to feed into the learning and educational experience of those within social work courses at the university, to give our lived experience, our input, and it's welcomed and wholly embraced by all those who are part of this. My background is basically I'm in quite a unique position because I was a commissioner in social care. So I commissioned services for people with dementia, with autism, with learning disabilities. And I also then found that I myself, because I have physical and mental health issues, needed the intervention of social workers, which was quite an interesting dynamic. So that's me, and now over to Victoria.
Thanks. I'm Victoria. I'm based up in the Northeast, and I'm relatively new to working with Social Work Voices in that I've only sort of joined the group in the past few months. Very much like Steve, I come from a slightly mixed background in that I've got a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder and have a history with, I suppose they call them risky behaviours, the sort that have attracted the attention of social workers, and hopefully I'm in a place now where that's not the case, but I'm also working for the voluntary and community sector as both an employee and a freelancer. So bringing things like co-production and peer-produced services into health, media and well-being services up here in the Northeast.
So Social Work Voices, and I think you'll probably had a fairly good idea already that we're a group who are incredibly open about our own experiences and what we can bring to the university in terms of added value. So we've already given you a flavour of this without particularly intending to. So we are absolutely central to the teaching and learning experience within the university. We're obviously really passionate about using our differing experiences in a really positive way. So a lot of what we do is about co-production. It runs through everything that we get involved in. And co-production, it's obviously not just a word. We hear it bandied about so much. Oh, we co-produce this, we co-produce that, because we had a service user turn up to one of our events. Okay, all right. But co-production, we believe in its purest form, is a coming together of minds who share a common vision to find solutions, and we worked, it involves working together from beginning until end, until the very end, and we evaluate, and then we go back and we work together again. So everything that Social Work Voices does is co-produced. So we're involved in the creation, the brainstorming, the planning, delivery, and evaluation of those activities within the university. And indeed, this very seminar is being sort of co-produced. We don't always agree, which is great, you know, and there are challenges and there are real positives, but we can recreate, we can create and address issues that we've experienced ourselves in our own lives, and we can share those life experiences. So in a nutshell, real life concerns are the heart of education, and we improve the educational experience for all those involved.
So just to kind of add to that a little bit, but that is a really brilliant explanation and certainly covers everything I understand co-production and learning and teaching to be. But when I was a teacher of media studies and society, health and development and health and social care at A level, we were always taught during our teaching practice about learning from the past, our own teaching practice, but also the experience that other people had to bring, engaging our audience, your class, your students, and making the lessons really relevant and really interesting, and valuing the experience of colleagues. Now, there's no reason that experience of colleagues can't include people with lived experience. I was involved with a program for the McPin Foundation as a service user, where they were introducing into their social workers training program the idea of social prescribing. So training the social workers to be in the community, be aware of the services, and assist people they were working with to access them in a more holistic and fluid way. And I certainly felt very much all the things that Steve has mentioned about sort of being valued, not being tokenistic, and kind of being part of that panel as someone who had a legitimate reason to be there and something really valuable to offer. So certainly going forward through this webinar, I've got a few examples, both as someone who has been involved in co-production as a service user, but also as someone who's kind of been part of the teams who've been recruiting people into the co-production of services for the voluntary sector. And I'll be kind of drawing on some of those examples as we kind of go forward.
My name is Lawrence Taylor, but they call me Larry, because they can't say Lawrence, it's too big. I've been disabled by stroke since 2006, when I was working and living in the Middle East. And now I'm part of the Social Work Voices group at URS. And here I am, in the flesh.
Hello, my name is Deb, and I'm a part of it.
My name is Chris Meggs. I represent, as you can see, the youth department of Social Worker Voices. I have lived experience and towards the end of my recovery period, I think, from a stroke, which I had in November 2012, brought on by my enthusiastic use of alcohol, apparently.
Sorry, I was muted. We're going to hear a little bit about the power of storytelling. Now, I wasn't totally convinced about including this at the very start, but actually reading it through, I totally buy into this. So just have a listen to this because it's incredibly powerful.
And she wrapped her arms around me and she held me. And that hug is the first time I ever knew for certain that my mother loved me for every part of me. And it's a transformative moment because it's the moment that I no longer was just moved by story, but I understood the power of story. I understood the power of stories communicated firsthand to, in this case, in one evening, dispel all of the myths, the lies, the stereotypes about LGBTQ people she learned from the military, from the South, and the Mormon Church over decades. Gone.
Just from chatting to people?
Because I think the greatest lie detector on earth is not the thing they strap onto you in some jail. It's looking someone in the eye. And so I say to people nowadays, you want to change a heart, which is the path to the mind, sit down across from someone.
Yeah.
Tell a story. If you start getting into the science and the math and the politics of it all, they're just going to dig their trenches deeper and you're going to get in a fight. And it doesn't matter how much all of that is on your side. It sadly doesn't. I wish it did. But if you can tell that story while they're looking you in the eye and understand that you're telling them the truth, you can change somebody like that.
And that's exactly what we do. We go into the classroom, we look students in the eye, they look us in the eye, and we have this dialogue, we have this exchange, and it's powerful, and it's surprising, and it's challenging, and it's everything you'd want it to be. So it's exactly what we do.
I mentioned about having a few sort of case studies of where I've been involved with projects where service user voices have been really valuable. I mentioned about the McPinn Foundation and training social workers, getting our perspective on everything from the mugs that they designed to the way that wording was done on posters. Was it inclusive? Was it understandable? But actually, one of the most powerful experiences that I've had of the service user voice was a project that I did that involved a podcast. So we gathered together people with lived experience of mental health issues. It was a project funded by Comic Relief, and we developed a monthly podcasting series called Mentally Sound. And people were able to submit their own stories or speak live on the radio if they felt comfortable to do so. And they were involved in everything from the editorial decisions and the sort of admin and planning of each individual show to the hosting, the interviewing. And it was a really powerful way to also include decision makers and people with significant amounts of power and responsibility in the NHS trusts who were making the decisions. We had kind of a gateway to go and interview them and speak to them and confront them as well. And it was kind of just this brilliant experience of the service user voice at its absolute peak in terms of being heard, being valued, having agency, and enabling people who were at the time, including myself, still going through their journey. There were some quite unwell people who were still able to contribute when they could. And obviously, I can share links and things in the chat because the show is still going 7 years later, and you can listen to some of the podcasts and things if you have an interest in mental health. But yeah, it was a fantastic project, and just the absolute power of not only service users coming together to achieve something in terms of being heard, but also the fact that it was media. So it was really fun, and it was a really positive and engaging project for people as well.
Can I just say that I think that piece that you just said, Victoria, was really interesting in terms of listening, actually listening to people. How often do we really listen? I know I don't. I listen to what the person is saying so that I can get my defenses ready, I can get my response ready, but I'm not really listening to what they're saying and what's important to them. And I think co-production, true co-production, is so reliant on active listening, but we'll talk about that a little bit later.
An organisation like SWV enables you to mine the research and development and experience that's already there. So you don't start every case with a blank sheet. You've got, oh, Larry knows about that, or whatever. No, I'll have a chat.
We bring to the table a lot of experience, good or bad, with social work. It's not all good, it's not all bad. And I think this, if we can impart this to the students, I think they get a stronger feel for what they're going to do. And having done quite a few group things with students, they seem to value our involvement rather than just sitting listening to a lecturer telling them a load of stuff which probably goes in one ear, it comes out the other.
Honesty, open face, perhaps.
He's not afraid to say no. He's not afraid to tell people what they think. Someone who wants to help to change their issues, the problems.
I hope they see someone who's been there before, understands them, can empathise with the situation. And I think that's what I bring, someone who's trusted.
There are more people like myself and people who want to get every doors for people to come in and talk better.
There were some really telling words hidden in there, which I hoped everybody picked up. What I heard, first of all, was honesty, and we are honest with each other, we are honest with the students, we are honest with the tutors. And I don't know what other environments people who are relative strangers would be so open and honest. There was talk about bravery, the need to be brave, and it's not just us as service participants who need to be brave in sharing our stories. Sometimes that's the easy part. The bravery comes from tutors and lecturers who are giving us that space they're actually handing over some of the power to us. And I think that's an incredibly brave thing to do. And there's also bravery on the side of the students. It can be uncomfortable listening to us, to some of our experiences. It can challenge some of their assumptions, which is never a bad thing, but it does take bravery. There was talk about experience. Yes, we bring experience, and we have this open face, which relates again to being honest. The been there before, and we've seen it. And there's a great deal of trust placed in social work voices, particularly from those students, to actually guide them correctly, to tell it really as it is. And that phrase is it's totally what we do. We tell it as it is. And Seb talked about trying to open doors that are so often closed to him. Seb is absolutely amazing, and he really has found his voice, and he is pushing against those doors, and he is really making a difference, and he is adding such significant value to our learning.
One thing that I wanted to kind of add is just kind of building on what Steve said there about opening doors. I've mentioned earlier that I've got borderline personality disorder. I've been in and out of services for 20 years. At one point, my 4 children were kind of under the watchful eye of social services because of the personal difficulties I was having, particularly around suicidal feelings and self-harm. And all that is not very glamorous. It's quite horrible and hard to hear. But yet, with projects like Mentally Sound, I was able to use my experiences with mental health difficulties to do a 20-minute segment on discussing the nature of suicide in It's a Wonderful Life as part of a Christmas special. It's about, taking what you're familiar with, what you know, and making it interesting and making it engaging, and to kind of take that to its next step in terms of involvement and inclusivity and progression into other sectors beyond sociology, social work, psychology, mental health. Kind of to involve other disciplines was kind of my next step. Some people who, as service users, become involved in service user research and join organisations like the McPin Foundation or groups such as Social Work Voices, can continue to make a huge contribution as they become more further forward on their sort of journey to wellness and help improve services and reflect on service change. But you can actually take those skills that you pick up doing that service user involvement and take them into other areas. So I've worked for Mentally Sound. I was producer of that radio show. And I took this idea of service user involvement and co-production, and I took it to paid employment with an organisation called Digital Voice up here in Gateshead. And what they do is they go into communities, they bring digital technology, so they bring the skills and equipment to make animation, both traditional hand-drawn animation and digital animation. And they get people to tell their stories in a really engaging way. And we use that not only to tell people's stories who were potentially vulnerable, so victims of domestic violence and abuse, but also to look at history and culture within the mining communities in County Durham. So we spoke to people and got them to tell their story. They planned what they wanted to tell us, how they wanted to express that. They brought photographs, they reminisced, and we turned that into a digital package of website content, social media, and short digital films that told their story. So completely focused around the idea of their lived experience growing up within the mining communities of County Durham, collecting and kind of preserving that history for future generations, but doing it in such a way where the people that we were speaking to were never exploited, they were never mined for their information and their data. It was all about them leading that process. What stories did they want to tell? How did they think that those stories were best told? Matching people up to have conversations and kind of build a whole community picture for the village that we could then take forward as an exhibition online. And this was all during COVID as well. So it was kind of on the ball with all the kind of ideas about digital inclusion that were going on as well, and digital skills and working with communities and bringing something positive. So just in terms of that kind of across the disciplines thing, yes, I started out talking about my story and what it was like having mental health issues and sort of in that mental health bubble. And I have been in a position to speak with decision makers and give feedback and make a difference. And I'm in no way belittling those opportunities because they're really important. But I've taken those skills and I've seen them work so well in media and in history, and kind of involving whole communities and sort of coming out of that bubble of mental health services. So I just really kind of want to make it really clear that lived experience is really valuable, but should never be placed in this singular box of social work and social care and mental health. It's got such value outside of that across the other disciplines, whether or not that's having someone just coming and speaking to a class who's got lived experience and giving it that kind of authenticity that you can't necessarily provide reading from research and your own knowledge, or whether or not it's actually taking it that step further and kind of embedding people within those lived experiences and creating things like those digital stories. But again, I'll share some of that information in the chat in case you want to take a look at some of those, because they're really wonderful and such a good way to capture that kind of that spirit of kind of cultures that have sort of been and gone in some ways, but are very much alive and vibrant in people's memories.
Just to add to what Victoria said, I was hugely privileged a few years ago to listen to a chap called Frank Bright, who is one of the Holocaust survivors. He lost his mother and his father in the gas chambers. And he, as a 16-year-old, he then came to this country, assumed his new name, his new life. And he goes, I think I listened to him at Northgate High School in Ipswich, and he relayed that so powerfully. And it was quite emotional, and it's very, very touching. And there's nothing I could have read that would have touched me in such a way as hearing that authentic, as Victoria says, that authentic voice. Okay, so what do we need for co-production to work?
In order to do anything, at the base level, you need to communicate with someone.
What is important to me is that they listen. And when we're telling our tale, read between the lines, because we may not say everything that's relevant, and they can pick out little points that they can focus on.
Cooperation. And that's when, in the course of communicating, you find something that you can contribute to another person's efforts, or vice versa. Coordinating, where you have a shared objective and you work towards that. And the icing on the cake with that is co-production, where you do that towards a common goal, common aim.
You need to take time with me. And not only, you need to take time with everyone.
How can you implement co-production into your learning and teaching? Communication, but as we've already talked about, listening, employing those listening skills, those active listening skills. Be patient, take time with people, give people space, and working towards a common goal that benefits everyone involved. Ensure that everybody is aware of what those common goals are. I was privileged in designing a dementia pathway, and it was only about halfway through, this is a few years ago, and co-production was in its infancy, that I wondered if I should include people with dementia. Now that sounds absolutely ironic, that you wouldn't think of involving them when you're designing something for them. I'd engaged with carers, but I hadn't taken the time to actually engage with people with dementia, because I'd made an assumption that they weren't going to add anything of value here, but they were absolutely amazing and completely transformed what would have been another fairly staid health local authority pathway into something that was vibrant, it was relevant, it was alive, it was tailored, and it was like that light bulb moment. So implement it into your learning and teaching, be brave, make a space for it, because you'll find that it will soon be central to your learning and teaching.
So rehumanizing learning and teaching, I think anyone who's involved in education will certainly agree with me that, you know, there's a huge amount of pressure to kind of cover the material, make sure the students pass the assessments and then move on. There isn't always breathing room for really exploring what it is to be learning and what it is to be teaching, which is such a shame. But kind of luckily for us, this idea of using lived experience is almost a quick win shortcut. If you can't humanize the learning and teaching beyond what you have to cover, then you can always involve people who are living those experiences to give them a legitimacy and a real honesty, and encourage students to ask questions, encourage yourself to ask questions. And one place where, when I wasn't shoving video cameras and microphones in people's faces, that I've been working has been Aspire Learning Support and Wellbeing. It's another Northeast based organisation. And the reason that I'm bringing them up here today is because their support services for women are entirely designed and implemented and evaluated with 100% cooperation and enthusiasm of their volunteers, who are all women with lived experiences of domestic violence, of suicide and self-harm, of mental health issues. So those women join the organisation, they get trained, they call them supporting sisters once they're trained. And part of that training is embedding them in the team meetings, in the course and support service development and planning meetings. They have access to some of the anonymized data so that they can look at the effectiveness of the sessions that they're helping to co-facilitate. And they have a real ownership of the direction that that support is taking, and a real impact on the services that ultimately get offered by the organization. It's completely embedded, which is the really important thing. And it kind of goes back to what Steve was saying again about avoiding that ticking box tokenism of, well, we listened to someone's opinion and right, let's just go off and do our own thing. We've kind of ticked that box. It really is much more about taking the value and also giving that person value. It's got to be a two-way process, and that's where real humanizing happens, when we're respecting each other and valuing each other in terms of what people can give, and also what they're taking from that experience, whether it's you know, helping to rebuild a CV after a period of illness, whether it's having a chance to have their story captured on film and kind of preserved. Whatever it is, it really has to be a very mutual process. And when you stop and do co-production and service user involvement properly, it really is all about the benefits and getting something back from that time that's been invested.
I think one of the things we're very good at, social work voices, is we go into the uni and we do quite a bit of role play. We're role playing some quite complex, fictional, but you know, realistic life experiences, you know, complex family situations, the different dynamics. And I think the look on the students' faces, that will always stay with me. So it is turning some of their learning into something very real, very shouty, very in their face, very challenging. But like Victoria says, hugely enriching.
The humans are not statistics, they're people in progress. Involve them as people, not as someone who's suffering from this, that, or the other.
People are born with a sense of humour. You can't teach it. It's either in them or not in them. And I find humour, in whatever form, to be a bit of a coping mechanism. Humour breaks the ice. I think it brings people a bit closer.
So as we've seen, it really can bring the curriculum to life. It shows what's important to us, and hence what should be important to students as they go into their employment. As Larry said, sense of humour, and you'll find that with people with some lived experience are quite sort of very challenging, very on the edge situations. Humour somehow is still there, and it is that coping mechanism. And we also encourage students to take a more holistic viewpoint and to think about a solutions-focused approach. And there'll be more than hopefully one solution to every single situation.
Okay, so thinking about the sort of balanced view, obviously I was singing the praises of how organisations like Digital Voice and Mentally Sound and Aspire have used the benefits of service user experience to improve services, develop services, evaluate services. However, the issue of balance is always going to come up, particularly with an organisation like Aspire, where our supporting sister volunteers are making such a huge contribution in terms of delivering services, co-producing the development of those services, but ultimately not paid for the labour that they're giving. And obviously there is a power difference and a level of vulnerability when you place people in that position. And that always needs to be considered, whether or not you're just inviting a guest speaker who may potentially open up about some difficult experiences, or a role-playing exercise where some difficult issues might get touched upon. You have to remember that, going back to this idea of humanizing people, that you are speaking to someone who may have, whether it's in a historical context such as a Holocaust survivor, or it's a lived experience of surviving trauma and abuse, you know, that person still has to live with those experiences and memories after they've left the classroom, or they've left the session or the workspace. And it's about doing so in a way that's responsible and meets a duty of care to them. Just very quickly, I had a very bizarre experience where I'd met someone from the University of Northumbria when I was there helping to develop some of the sessions for their social work programme. And we got chatting, and I'd mentioned about some experiences that I'd had in the hospital while I was recovering from a suicide attempt. And all of a sudden, that became the basis of a chapter of a book on what is legally and illegally detaining someone under the Mental Health Act. And it all just grew very, very quickly into something that had started as a conversation and became the chapter of a book. And ultimately, I felt comfortable with the situation and it was handled very well. But those are people's stories, people's lives that are being portrayed. And there is a huge amount of responsibility if you are the person who is curating them, to not only be honest and representative, but also sensitive to what it is that they've been through, and that it's not just a tool for enabling learning. It is a person's life story at the end of the day.
We've already touched on telling it like it is, so I won't spend too much time on this. But you can I hope already understand that we do tell it as it is. We don't hide anything. We're completely open, and we'll talk about the messiness of life. My own journey was incredibly messy. And I must have been an absolute nightmare to my social worker, because, you know, we'd agree a pathway 1 week, and the following week I don't particularly want to do that. I want to do something else. So journeys are always winding, and we will try and relay that to students, and we'll try and relay that sense of realism to them as well. After all, lives are complex. And we want students to go with us on when we tell our story. They won't always be able to relate to what they see in practice, to an example in a textbook, but they may be able to relate what they see in practice to something which somebody from Social Work Voices has actually relayed to them, played out to them, explained to them, told them like it is. So we hope that we can add some quite significant value there. And there's so many themes that run through this. We've talked about the power of humor. We won't always get what we want, but we will fight, and we have a sense of defiance as well. And we'll also relay that very often when we're in these really difficult situations, we think it's all about us. And I can remember when my mental ill health was particularly severe, it was all about me, to me. What I completely ignored was the impact on my family and friends. The fact that I was sitting on the bed cutting the sleeves of my pullover didn't just impact on me. At the time, it seemed like the most sensible thing in the world to do, because why would I want sleeves? Why does anybody want sleeves? But we talk about things about like the need for choice and control, about being brave and trusting each other and trusting in those that we don't necessarily know. So those are the advantages of telling it as it is.
No one in the system wants to be in the system because they're choice. Choice is life, and life is hard for everyone. And most people in the system get it worse.
They have helped my recovery, which was long and hard. 15 years since the stroke. It's been a tough time. And being able to have a laugh during that time, I'm sure it's helped me.
But they're not on your own. So you need to find and include the people that you touch, and what you need and what you want is not always what you will get. So you need to fight. You need to fight. If you can't fight yourself, find your people around you, from your family or who support you, who's around you to fight for you.
I wasn't the only one that had the stroke. Everybody, my friends, my family, we all suffered a little bit in our own way. We all grieved in our own way. And you help me grieve.
What I want and what I need is two different things. It's my life. I should be able to decide what I want and need.
So we've talked about a lot of this already. We've talked about the sense of realism. We've talked about trying to prepare students for the challenges they may encounter in practice. And we've also talked about the complexity of life and the need to appreciate that complexity and that challenge, whatever the discipline.
I think just picking up on that idea of appreciating complexity, coming back to digital voice, I worked with the children of people who had spent time in prison and trying to raise awareness of what those experiences are like for families, and getting the young people to share their stories was challenging, partly from obviously a safeguarding perspective, but also because they couldn't necessarily articulate how they'd felt about having a parent in the prison system. And there are ways that we as facilitators for those stories have a duty to kind of source the best ways to enable them to tell their stories, whether it's engaging groups like the Social Work Voices group to bring people who are experienced at sharing their stories, or whether it's organizations like Digital Voice, where they engage with digital technologies to create animations and digital drawing to help people express themselves. It is really important to know who your allies are. And because it's such a potentially challenging process, unless you're going to start by saying, what is the best way to do this and who can help me do it, you're going to struggle. Because whether it's speaking to people in a mining community or engaging with women with lived experience of trauma, you are talking to human beings, and they're going to have different ways of approaching the material that you want to teach. They might not necessarily share your aims and objectives. And for it to be a process that works, everyone needs to kind of be working towards some sort of goal. So sometimes one of the best ways to face that challenge of kind of working with people who are potentially vulnerable or don't potentially agree with you is to kind of engage the services of a third party with more experience, and taking some of that burden off yourself and your own teaching, so you can kind of focus more on the aims and objectives of what you need to convey. I mean, obviously I could go on for ages and do a whole webinar in itself about the potential challenges around safeguarding and around, obviously, if you're coming at this from the point of view like I was of people with mental health issues, there's a lot of anger, a lot of tension. The people bring a lot of baggage, particularly when you've got a lot of people in a group who've maybe got very diverse experiences. Lots of things can be triggering. You need to be aware that you're going to have to facilitate and manage that in a really sensitive way, but also that you're going to let people be themselves, because if you don't, you are censoring their story, and that's not what involvement should be about. Sometimes people will get angry and kick a bin across a room and shout and scream, and okay, that has happened to me in meetings. Try minuting that. But we move forward. We find ways to review our processes and improve them so that people aren't feeling that level of anger during a meeting, or we facilitate it all in a different way. But it's a constant process, and one that does need to be reviewed and to work for the people that you're working with. So while yes, there are challenges, there are always solutions, I think, is the kind of the positive end to that.
I think the biggest challenge for me when I was commissioning was in not being the total owner of knowledge, and giving a lot of that away, and that was a huge difficulty. But we, you know, like you say, we get there. We get there in the end.
The system don't work, in my opinion. And I know that when people in my community, the issue that I come across is most people, my friends from school, college, and kids that I go to, they are afraid to come to the top because they know that for years nothing will happen, nothing happens. And they go to meetings, councils, board meetings, and talk and share ideas and say things that is important and nothing happens.
My personal record of social work involvement wasn't as good as it could have been. And so I'm seeking to address some of those things myself.
One of the people who have a disability or live in the same or a system, suddenly they take on a ride because they don't feel that they have a voice, they don't want to because they're afraid to, they don't know how to do it, they don't want to say. I believe that it's better than 25 years. According to it is, and most people tell me before, advice, oh, it's better than 25 years now. Yes, of course it is. It could, but it's not gonna, it can't stop now. No one should be taking on a ride because they have something very different in most people.
Okay, I think we've covered everything on this slide. So if we just move on. Disruption. We're covering some very big subject matter here. We haven't really got time to delve into it in depth, but I'm a huge exponent of disruption because I think if you disrupt what exists already, you knock it down, you build from the ground up, you can focus more clearly, you have no distractions, you're not building on added bits along the way, there are no politics involved. But equally, there's more to be discovered. But we'll perhaps do something on disruption in the future.
And the people who run the system and committee and the council and UK government, they have it for me and my community and my friends and my family and the support organization. You know, so is it how are they going to fix or change the system? No, how it is. And they're getting better. They want to know more now.
Okay, so
Being
that's okay. No, I was just going to say, I think we've more or less covered the benefits, so we could just spin on. So yeah, just go for it.
in the social work voices group gives me in touch with the real world in a way.
Seemed to me unlikely at best, if very possible, that I would find activities to do that didn't involve alcohol, that still gave me all the other things, like commanding respect from people, achieving stuff, enjoying myself.
I think a lot of people that I otherwise would not meet.
Is the power of conversation, power of communication, collaboration, coordination, whatever, co-production, all those things, to the point where people like Johann Hari will say that connection is the most important thing. Talking to people is the most important thing. It doesn't have to be about your illness. It's just the act of communicating. And of course, that requires you to have some self-worth. You've got to think you could bring something to the conversation. And people often don't, which is why they go into social isolation, don't open the bills, don't pick up the phone, and that sort of thing, which is, there's a progression to all these things, which is one of the reasons I applied to join the.
It's important to me because I find on a personal basis cathartic. It helps me deal with some little problems I might have, be it mental or physical. And then I feel useful.
And that if we just talk, things get better. And I've seen that with my own eyes in meetings. I've seen people initially resistant to open up their hearts, to needing to come to meetings to do that. People don't realise that there are other people out there with exactly the same concerns, issues, so on. And being able to talk about that with them is invaluable.
So we consider that power of connection and conversation is hugely valuable, not just for students, not just for academics, but for us as humans. So we need to have our voice heard. We need that sense of value. And so often in the past, we've had some real positive feedback from those at the university and in the wider community. And in the future, we will be doing more with the wider community. So that connectedness, if I can say it, is all important. Thank you ever so much for listening to us and for asking some brilliant questions. I'm sure I'm speaking for Victoria here, but we've enjoyed this, haven't we, Victoria? We've enjoyed giving this, and we could talk for 3 weeks on this subject. So many thanks to you all.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure to be part of this and to share my journey, which has sort of encompassed both sides of being one of the people being called up to be involved, and now obviously drawing people in to be involved. And yeah, it's really empowering, and that's the way it should be. So thank you all for buying into all this and wanting to embrace it and hear more about it.